The scorching summer of 1883 in the Arizona Territory was proving to be one of the deadliest on record. Waterholes had dried up across the Sonoran Desert, and tensions between settlers and Apache tribes had reached a breaking point that would soon explode into violence. But when a wounded cowboy named Samuel Hayes stumbled upon a desperate Apache mother protecting her dying children in the ruins of an abandoned mission, the choice he made in that moment would not only save lives, it would transform an entire region's understanding of what it truly means to be human. This is the story of how one man's willingness to sacrifice everything for strangers led to the most extraordinary act of gratitude ever witnessed in the American Southwest, and how that single moment of compassion would bridge two worlds that had been at war for generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drought of 1883 began in early March, when the seasonal rains that normally replenish the desert simply never came. By June, the situation had become catastrophic throughout the Arizona Territory. Rivers that had flowed for centuries were reduced to cracked mudbeds, and water sources that Apache tribes and American settlers had depended on for generations had completely vanished. Samuel Hayes had been working cattle in this unforgiving landscape for 8 years, ever since he'd arrived from Texas with nothing but a horse, a worn saddle, and the determination to build something meaningful in the vast expanse of the Southwest. At 29, Sam was considered one of the most skilled ranch hands in the territory, known for his ability to find water and pasture even in the harshest conditions. His weathered face and calloused hands told the story of countless days spent under the brutal desert sun. But his steady blue eyes still held the optimism of a man who believed that hard work and fair dealing would eventually be rewarded. The Circle W Ranch, where Sam worked as foreman, sprawled across nearly 50,000 acres of what had once been prime grazing land. Owner William Crawford, a former cavalry officer who had settled in Arizona after his military service, had built the operation into one of the most successful cattle enterprises in the territory. The ranch employed 15 full-time hands and provided seasonal work for dozens more, creating a small community centered around the main buildings nestled in a valley between two ridges of red sandstone. But the drought was systematically destroying everything Crawford and his men had built. Cattle that had thrived on the rich desert grasses were now skin and bones, desperately searching for vegetation that no longer existed. The natural springs that had made the Circle W's location so valuable had dried up one by one, forcing the ranchers to dig deeper and deeper wells that yielded less and less water with each passing week. Sam spent his days riding the fence lines, checking on scattered herds, and making the impossible decisions about which animals to save and which to let go. The sight of dead cattle dotting the landscape had become grimly familiar, but it never got easier. Each carcass represented not just financial loss, but the failure of the careful planning and hard work that went into building a sustainable operation in the desert. The human cost was becoming just as severe. Crawford had been forced to lay off half his crew, sending good men away with promises of work when the rains returned. The remaining hands worked longer hours for reduced pay, knowing that the ranch's survival depended on their ability to keep the operation running with minimal resources. Families in the nearest town of Esperanza, 20 miles south, were beginning to leave for California or return east, abandoning homesteads and businesses they had spent years building. But the drought was affecting more than just the American settlers. The Apache tribes who had lived in this region for countless generations were facing an even more desperate situation. Their traditional water sources, hidden springs and seasonal pools known only to tribal elders, had vanished along with everything else. The plants and animals that had sustained their way of life were disappearing, forcing proud people who had never depended on outside help to consider options that challenged their most fundamental beliefs about independence and survival. The relationship between the Apache and the American settlers had always been complex and often hostile. Years of broken treaties, misunderstandings, and violent conflicts had created deep mistrust on both sides. The U.S. Army maintained a significant presence in the territory, and skirmishes between soldiers and Apache warriors were a regular occurrence. Most settlers viewed the Apache as dangerous obstacles to civilization, while many Apache saw the Americans as invaders who threatened their ancestral lands and traditional way of life. The drought was intensifying these tensions in dangerous ways. As resources became scarcer, competition for the few remaining water sources was creating confrontations that threatened to explode into full-scale warfare. Both sides were arming themselves and preparing for conflicts that everyone knew would be devastating for both communities. Samuel Hayes found himself caught in the middle of these escalating tensions. His reputation for fairness and his ability to work with people from different backgrounds had made him a respected figure among both the ranch hands and the townspeople of Esperanza. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Sam had made an effort to learn some Apache words and customs during his years in the territory. He understood that the Apache were not simply hostile savages, but people trying to preserve their way of life in the face of overwhelming changes. This perspective put him at odds with some of his fellow settlers, who viewed any sympathy for the Apache as dangerous naivety. William Crawford, despite his respect for Sam's abilities, often warned him that his openness to understanding Apache culture could lead to trouble. The territory was no place for idealism, Crawford would say. Survival required clear lines between friend and enemy, and those who couldn't maintain those distinctions often didn't live long enough to regret their mistakes. The tension came to a head in late July, when a group of Apache warriors was spotted near one of the Circle W's few remaining water sources. Crawford immediately organized an armed patrol to drive them away, arguing that allowing any access would encourage more raids and ultimately threaten the ranch's survival. Most of the hands supported this position, understanding that their livelihoods depended on protecting the resources that kept the operation viable. Sam volunteered to lead the patrol, but not for the reasons Crawford expected. He had been thinking about the impossible situation facing everyone in the territory, and he was beginning to believe that the traditional approach of competition and confrontation was making the crisis worse for everyone involved. Maybe, he thought, there was a way to find solutions that didn't require one group to destroy another. The morning Sam rode out with 5 other ranch hands to confront the Apache at the water source. The temperature was already over 90 degrees and climbing. The sky was a harsh, cloudless blue that seemed to mock everyone below who was praying for rain. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and terrible in its vastness, dotted with saguaro cacti that stood like silent sentinels over a land that was slowly dying of thirst. As they approached the water source, a small spring hidden in a grove of mesquite trees, Sam could see the Apache camp in the distance, but something was wrong with the scene. Instead of the organized activity he expected from a raiding party, he saw what appeared to be a desperate group of families, including women and children, clustered around makeshift shelters that looked like they had been hastily constructed from whatever materials could be found. Through his field glasses, Sam watched an Apache woman moving between the shelters, clearly trying to care for people who were sick or injured. Her movements had the frantic energy of someone dealing with a crisis that was beyond her ability to handle alone. Even from a distance, he could see that the people in the camp were in serious trouble. The other ranch hands were ready to charge into the camp and drive the Apache away by force, but Sam held them back. Something about the scene didn't match their expectations of a hostile raiding party. These people looked less like warriors preparing for battle and more like refugees desperately trying to survive. As Sam studied the situation more carefully, he began to understand what he was seeing. This wasn't a raiding party at all. It was a group of Apache families who had been driven from their traditional territory by the drought and were making a last, desperate attempt to find water and shelter for their most vulnerable members. The woman he had been watching was clearly a mother trying to save children who were dying of thirst and exposure. The realization hit him like a physical blow. These people were facing the same crisis that was destroying his own community, but they had even fewer options for survival. They couldn't retreat to town or send for supplies from back east. They couldn't dig deeper wells or buy water from distant sources. They were completely dependent on their ability to find natural resources in a landscape that was no longer able to support life. Sam made a decision that would change everything. Instead of attacking the Apache camp, he was going to approach them peacefully and try to understand what they needed. It was a choice that would put him at odds with his own people and violate every rule of frontier survival he had ever learned. But looking at that desperate mother trying to save her children, Sam knew he couldn't simply drive them away to die somewhere else. What Sam Hayes didn't know was that his decision to approach the Apache camp with compassion, rather than violence, was about to lead him into a situation that would test every belief he held about duty, sacrifice, and what it meant to be human. The Apache mother he had seen from a distance was named Maria Santos, and her story of survival and loss would soon become intertwined with his own in ways that neither of them could have imagined. The sun climbed higher into the merciless sky as Sam prepared to make the most important decision of his life. Behind him, his fellow ranch hands waited for orders that would determine whether the next few hours would bring violence or the possibility of something unprecedented in the bitter history between their two peoples, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Samuel Hayes dismounted from his horse 50 yards from the Apache camp, his hands clearly visible and empty of weapons. The 5 ranch hands behind him shifted nervously in their saddles, unsure whether their foreman had lost his mind or discovered some tactical advantage they couldn't see. Tom Bradley, the most experienced of the group, urged his horse forward. "Sam, what in blazes are you doing?" Bradley whispered urgently. "Crawford sent us here to clear them out, not have a social visit." Sam turned to face his men, his weathered face set with determination. "Look at that camp, Tom. Really look at it. Those aren't warriors preparing for a raid. Those are families dying of thirst, just like our cattle." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every man in Sam's group had their rifle within easy reach, and they could see Apache men positioned defensively around the camp's perimeter. One wrong move from either side could trigger a bloodbath that would echo through the territory for years to come. As Sam walked slowly toward the camp, an elderly Apache man emerged from behind one of the makeshift shelters. His face was deeply lined with age and hardship, but his eyes remained sharp and alert. He wore traditional Apache clothing, mixed with pieces of American-made fabric, a visual representation of the complex world both cultures now inhabited. Despite his advanced age, he carried himself with the dignity of someone who had earned respect through decades of wisdom and leadership. The old man studied Sam carefully, noting the cowboy's deliberate, non-threatening approach. When he spoke, it was in heavily accented but clear English, learned through years of necessity in dealing with the changing world around his people. "You come with guns, but walk without them in your hands," the elder said, his voice carrying across the small distance between them. "This is unusual for your kind." Sam stopped 10 feet away, close enough to talk, but far enough to show he respected their space. "I come because I saw families in trouble. My name is Samuel Hayes. I work for the Circle W Ranch." The mention of the ranch name caused a visible reaction among the Apache. Several women pulled children closer to their sides, and the defensive positions around the camp became more pronounced. The Circle W had been involved in several conflicts with Apache groups over water rights and grazing land. From their perspective, Sam represented everything that threatened their survival. The elderly man nodded slowly. "I'm Joseph Blackhorse. These are my people." He gestured toward the camp behind him. "We know of your ranch. Your boss sends soldiers to drive us from waterholes." "Not soldiers," Sam corrected gently. "Ranch hands like me. But you're right about the driving away part. That's what I was supposed to do today, but you do not?" Joseph's eyes narrowed with curiosity. Sam looked past the elder toward the camp, where he could now see the full extent of the crisis these families were facing. Children lay motionless in whatever shade could be found, their small bodies showing the unmistakable signs of severe dehydration. Women moved between them with cloth and precious drops of water, trying to provide comfort when there was no real relief to offer. The men of the group stood guard, but their posture spoke of desperation rather than aggression. "How long have you been without water?" Sam asked. Joseph's shoulders sagged slightly. 7 days since the last spring dried up. We traveled 2 days to reach this place, hoping... He gestured toward the small seepage of water that barely constituted a spring. "But this gives little." "Not enough." Sam knelt down and examined the water source that had brought both groups into conflict. What he found was heartbreaking. The spring was nothing more than a tiny seepage that produced perhaps 2 gallons of water per day, not nearly enough to sustain either a cattle operation or a group of desperate families. "How many people?" Sam asked, though he was beginning to count for himself. 23. 8 children. Joseph's voice carried the weight of someone responsible for lives he wasn't sure he could save. As if summoned by their conversation, a woman approached from the camp. Sam recognized her immediately as the person he had observed through his field glasses, the mother who had been moving frantically between the shelters. Up close, her desperation was even more apparent. She was probably in her early 30s, with long black hair tied back practically, and clothing that showed the wear of hard travel. But it was her eyes that struck Sam most forcefully. They held the fierce determination of a mother willing to do anything to save her children, combined with the terrible knowledge that her options were running out. "This is Maria Santos," Joseph said in introduction. "She speaks your language well." Maria stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Sam with an intensity that was both challenging and pleading. "You come to tell us to leave," she said. "It wasn't a question. I came because that's what I was told to do," Sam admitted. "But now that I'm here..." He looked around the camp again, taking in details that made the situation even more heartbreaking. Crude shelters made from cactus ribs and scraps of cloth provided minimal protection from the sun. Children lay on rough blankets, their breathing shallow and labored. The few adults who weren't tending to the sick stood watch with weapons that looked more symbolic than functional. "Your children," Sam said to Maria. "Which ones are yours?" Maria's composure cracked slightly. She pointed toward a shelter where 2 small forms lay motionless. "Miguel is 6. Elena is 4. They have not opened their eyes since yesterday." The words hit Sam like a physical blow. He had spent years working around cattle, and he recognized the signs of terminal dehydration. These children were dying, and unless something changed dramatically within the next few hours, they wouldn't survive another day. Behind him, Sam could hear his ranch hands growing restless. Tom Bradley called out, "Sam, we need to move this along. Crawford's expecting us back before dark." But Sam was no longer thinking about Crawford's expectations or ranch politics. He was looking at 2 dying children and their mother's desperate face, and every instinct he possessed was telling him that walking away would be the worst kind of moral failure. "What do you need?" he asked Maria quietly. The question seemed to surprise her. "Water," she said simply. "Medicine. A place where the children can rest without the sun. Food." She gestured helplessly. "Everything we do not have." Sam made a mental calculation. The Circle W had well water, medical supplies, and food stores. They also had wagons that could transport sick children more safely than the travois and pack animals the Apache were using. Everything these families needed to survive was available at the ranch. But asking Crawford to share resources with Apache families would be asking him to violate every principle that governed frontier life. "How far did you travel to get here?" Sam asked Joseph. 3 days from our last camp." Before that, 5 days from the place before, we move when water runs out, but now, the old man spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. There is nowhere left to go, Maria added. The army has closed the reservation boundaries. They say we must stay in the assigned area, but there is no water there anymore. The children cannot wait for rain that may not come. Sam understood the impossible position these families faced. Government policy required them to remain on designated land, but that land could no longer support life. Leaving meant risking conflict with military patrols, but staying meant watching their children die of thirst. The moral complexity of the situation was staggering. These Apache families weren't raiders or troublemakers. They were refugees from an environmental disaster that was affecting everyone in the territory. They had followed the same survival instincts that drove Sam's own people to dig deeper wells and drive cattle to distant water sources. The only difference was that the Apache had fewer options and fewer resources to draw upon. Sam. Tom Bradley's voice carried a sharp edge of warning. "We've got company coming." Sam turned to see dust clouds on the horizon, riders approaching fast from the direction of Esperanza. From the size of the dust cloud, it looked like a significant group, possibly military patrol or a posse from town. Either option meant trouble for the Apache families and probably for Sam as well if he was found negotiating with them instead of driving them away. Joseph Blackhorse had seen the riders too. Without a word, the Apache men began moving their families toward the horses and pack animals, preparing for another desperate flight across the desert. But Maria Santos didn't move. She stood beside the shelter where her children lay dying, her face set with the terrible resolve of someone who had reached the end of their options. "I will not move them again," she said quietly. "They are too weak. If we must die, we die here." The approaching riders were getting closer. Sam could make out individual figures now. It was indeed a military patrol, probably responding to reports of Apache movement in the area. The soldiers would arrive within minutes, and when they did, they would expect to find either a successful mission to clear out the Apache or evidence of resistance that justified more aggressive action. Sam Hayes stood at the crossroads of his life, looking at dying children on one side and approaching soldiers on the other. Everything about his upbringing, his culture, and his responsibilities as foreman of the Circle W told him to step back and let events unfold according to the established rules of frontier conflict. But everything about his conscience told him that those rules were about to result in the deaths of innocent children who deserved better than to become casualties. In a war over resources that belonged to the desert itself, the decision he made in the next few moments would determine not only the fate of Maria Santos and her children, but the trajectory of his own life and the future of relations between two communities that had been locked in seemingly endless conflict. As the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, Sam realized that everything he thought he knew about duty, loyalty, and survival was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined possible. The dust cloud on the horizon resolved into 8 cavalry soldiers riding hard toward the spring, their blue uniforms dark with sweat and their horses lathered from the brutal desert heat. Leading them was Lieutenant Marcus Thompson, a young officer whose rigid adherence to military protocol had earned him both respect and resentment during his 2 years stationed at Fort Verde. Thompson had been ordered to investigate reports of Apache movement near American settlements, and he approached every such mission with the conviction that decisive action prevented larger conflicts. Sam Hayes watched the soldiers approach and made a split-second decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of stepping away from the Apache families to avoid association with them, he moved closer to Maria Santos and placed himself between her dying children and the incoming patrol. "Tom," Sam called to his ranch hands without taking his eyes off the approaching cavalry. "Take the men back to the ranch. Del Crawford, I'll explain everything when I return." Tom Bradley's face flushed red with frustration and disbelief. "Sam, you can't be serious. You're going to get yourself killed over a bunch of Indians you don't even know. That's an order, Tom, Sam said firmly. His voice carried the authority of 8 years as foreman, but also something deeper, a moral certainty that surprised even him. These people aren't our enemies. They're families trying to survive, just like us. The ranch hands exchanged uncertain glances. They had followed Sam Hayes through dangerous situations before, and his judgment had always proven sound. But this decision seemed to violate every survival instinct that governed life in the Arizona Territory. Reluctantly, they began to retreat, though Tom Bradley continued to voice his objections. This is madness, Sam. Crawford's gonna have your hide for this, and that's assuming the Apaches don't scalp you first. As his men rode away, Sam turned his full attention to the crisis unfolding around him. Lieutenant Thompson's patrol was now close enough that individual faces were visible, and Sam could see the grim determination that marked soldiers preparing for potential combat. The Apache families were scattering toward their horses and pack animals, but Maria Santos remained motionless beside her children's shelter. Joseph Blackhorse approached Sam with measured steps. "Your men leave, but you stay. Why?" Sam looked toward the shelter where Miguel and Eleanor lay unconscious, their small chests barely rising and falling with each labored breath. "Because those children are dying, and running won't save them." The old Apache leader studied Sam's face for a long moment, searching for deception or hidden motives. What he saw instead was something unprecedented in his decades of dealing with American settlers, genuine concern for Apache children from someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. "You understand what this means?" Joseph asked quietly. "Your people will see you as traitor. Our people will not trust your motives. The soldiers will arrest you or worse." Sam nodded slowly. "I understand, but I also understand that I can't walk away from dying children. No matter what color their skin is or what language they speak." Lieutenant Thompson's patrol arrived in a thunder of hoofbeats and dust, surrounding the spring with military precision. The young officer dismounted and surveyed the scene with the analytical eye of someone trained to assess threats and make rapid tactical decisions. What he found was more complex than his briefings had prepared him for. "I am Lieutenant Marcus Thompson, United States Army," he announced in a voice that carried across the camp. "This area has been declared off-limits to unauthorized Apache presence. You are ordered to disperse immediately and return to your designated reservation." Joseph Blackhorse stepped forward with the dignity that had served him well in countless negotiations. "Lieutenant, I am Joseph Blackhorse. We come seeking only water for our families. Our children are sick." Thompson's training had taught him to view Apache explanations with suspicion. Too many patrols had been ambushed by groups claiming peaceful intentions. "The reservation has adequate water and medical facilities. There is no reason for you to be in this area." "The reservation wells have failed," Maria Santos said, speaking for the first time to the soldiers. Her voice was steady despite the desperation of her situation. "Our children will die if we return there without water." Sam stepped forward, placing himself directly in Thompson's line of sight. "Lieutenant, my name is Samuel Hayes. I'm foreman at the Circle W Ranch. I can confirm that these families are in genuine distress. They're not raiders or troublemakers. They're refugees from the drought." Thompson's eyes narrowed as he processed this unexpected complication. "Mr. Hayes, you are interfering with a military operation. I advise you to step aside and return to your ranch immediately." "I can't do that, Lieutenant," Sam replied calmly. "These children need immediate medical attention. The nearest reservation is 2 days' travel, and they won't survive the journey in their current condition." The tension in the air became almost unbearable. Thompson's soldiers had their hands near their weapons, ready to respond to any sign of resistance. The Apache men had positioned themselves defensively around their families, prepared to fight if necessary to protect their most vulnerable members. Between them stood Sam Hayes, a cowboy whose simple act of compassion was threatening to trigger a confrontation that could escalate into territory-wide violence. Thompson studied the situation with growing frustration. His orders were clear: remove unauthorized Apache presence from American-controlled areas. But the presence of a respected ranch foreman complicated the simple execution of those orders. Sam Hayes wasn't just any settler. He was known throughout the territory as a man of integrity whose word could be trusted. "Mr. Hayes," Thompson said, attempting to find a diplomatic solution, "I understand your concerns, but military policy regarding Apache movement is not subject to civilian interpretation. These people must return to their designated area, even if it means watching children die?" Sam asked quietly. The question hung in the desert air like a challenge to everything Thompson had been taught about duty and military necessity. Around him, his soldiers waited for orders that would determine whether the next few minutes brought peaceful resolution or violence that would haunt everyone present for years to come. Maria Santos made the decision that changed everything. She walked slowly to the shelter where her children lay dying and carefully lifted Miguel, her 6-year-old son, in her arms. The boy's body was limp, his breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. She carried him toward Lieutenant Thompson, stopping just close enough for the young officer to see the child's condition clearly. "Look at him," she said simply. "Tell me what military necessity requires you to send a dying child back into the desert." Thompson found himself staring into the face of a child who was clearly in the final stages of dehydration. Miguel's lips were cracked and bleeding. His skin had taken on the waxy pallor that preceded death, and his eyes remained closed despite the movement and noise around him. The lieutenant had seen combat casualties before, but there was something uniquely devastating about witnessing the slow death of an innocent child. Sergeant William O'Connor, Thompson's most experienced non-commissioned officer, stepped closer to his commanding officer. O'Connor had served on the frontier for 12 years and had developed the practical wisdom that came from seeing the human cost of rigid policy implementation. "Lieutenant," O'Connor said quietly, "perhaps we should consider the humanitarian aspects of this situation." Thompson appreciated his sergeant's diplomatic phrasing, but he also understood the implications of what O'Connor was suggesting. Showing mercy to Apache families could be interpreted as weakness that encouraged future violations of territorial boundaries. But enforcing military policy against dying children would create the kind of incident that generated newspaper headlines and congressional investigations. Sam Hayes recognized the lieutenant's dilemma and stepped forward with a proposal that offered a potential solution. "Lieutenant Thompson, what if I take personal responsibility for these families? I can transport the sick children to medical care and ensure that the adults return to their designated area once the immediate crisis is resolved. You would risk your livelihood and your reputation for people you've never met before today?" Thompson asked, genuinely puzzled by Sam's motivations. Sam looked around the camp, taking in the full scope of the human tragedy unfolding in the desert heat. Children who should have been playing were instead fighting for their lives. Parents who should have been teaching and nurturing were instead watching helplessly as their young ones suffered. Grandparents who should have been sharing wisdom and stories were instead preparing for deaths that should never have been necessary. "Lieutenant," Sam said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "I've spent 8 years in this territory, learning how to survive in the desert. I've seen droughts and floods, good years and bad years, conflicts and cooperation. But I've never seen anything that's tested what I believe about right and wrong like this moment." He gestured toward Miguel, still unconscious in his mother's arms. "That boy isn't my enemy. He's not a threat to American interests or frontier security. He's a 6-year-old child who's dying of thirst, while adults argue about policies and boundaries. If saving his life means risking my job or my reputation, then so be it." Thompson found himself facing a decision that would define not only his military career, but his understanding of what it meant to serve his country with honor. The rulebook provided clear guidance about removing unauthorized Apache presence, but it offered no wisdom about how to balance military necessity against basic human compassion. The silence stretched across the desert camp as Lieutenant Thompson weighed his options. Around him, soldiers waited for orders that would determine whether they would be remembered as the patrol that enforced military discipline or the one that stood by while children died of thirst. The Apache families watched with the desperate hope of people who had run out of alternatives. And Sam Hayes stood between two worlds, offering himself as a bridge that might prevent tragedy and create the possibility of something unprecedented in the bitter history of frontier conflict. The decision Thompson made in that moment would echo through the territory for years to come, establishing precedents that would influence how future conflicts between cultures and communities were resolved. But more immediately, it would determine whether two dying children would live to see another sunrise, or become casualties in a war that had already claimed too many innocent lives. Lieutenant Thompson removed his hat and wiped the sweat from his brow, buying himself precious seconds to consider a decision that could end his military career or define it as something greater than routine enforcement of territorial policies. The weight of command had never felt heavier than it did in this moment. Standing in the desert heat with a dying child just feet away and two communities' future hanging in the balance. "Sergeant O'Connor," Thompson said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "what would you do if this were your son?" The grizzled sergeant looked toward Miguel, still unconscious in Maria's arms, then back at his commanding officer. "Sir, I've got 3 boys back in Ohio. If they were dying of thirst and some foreign soldier could save them but chose to follow orders instead." He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. Thompson nodded slowly, then turned to address the entire group, soldiers, Apache families, and Sam Hayes alike. "This situation falls outside standard operational parameters. I'm invoking emergency humanitarian authority under Section 12 of the Territorial Military Code." Sam had never heard of Section 12, and from the surprised look on Sergeant O'Connor's face, he suspected Thompson might be improvising. But the lieutenant's next words confirmed that whatever authority he was claiming, he intended to use it decisively. "Mr. Hayes," Thompson continued, "you offered to take personal responsibility for these families. I'm prepared to accept that offer under specific conditions. You will transport the sick children to proper medical care immediately. The adult members of these families will be given safe passage to return to their designated area once the medical crisis is resolved. And you will report to my commanding officer at Fort Verde within 1 week to provide a full account of this incident." Sam felt a mixture of relief and apprehension wash over him. Thompson was offering a solution that could save the children's lives, but accepting it would mean placing himself under military jurisdiction and accepting consequences he couldn't predict. "What kind of consequences am I looking at, Lieutenant?" "That will depend on how this situation develops," Thompson replied honestly. "If you successfully resolve this crisis without further incident, the military will likely view your actions as humanitarian assistance. If this leads to larger conflicts or security breaches, you could face charges ranging from interference with military operations to aiding enemies of the United States." Maria Santos stepped forward, still holding Miguel, but now looking directly at Sam with an intensity that made everyone else fade into the background. "You would risk this for children you do not know, for people your kind call enemies?" Sam met her gaze steadily. "Maria, I don't see enemies here. I see a mother trying to save her children. That's something any decent person should understand, regardless of what uniform they wear or what language they speak." Joseph Blackhorse had been listening to the exchange with the careful attention of someone who had survived decades of negotiations with American authorities. "Mr. Hayes, you offer much, but what do you ask in return? In my experience, white men do not help Apache without expecting payment." The question cut to the heart of everyone's suspicions about Sam's motives. Even Lieutenant Thompson was curious about what the cowboy hoped to gain from such a risky intervention. Sam took a moment to consider his answer. understanding that whatever he said next would determine whether the Apache families trusted him enough to accept his help. "I don't want payment," Sam said simply, "but I do want something. I want you to remember that not all Americans are your enemies. I want you to remember that some of us believe in helping people who need help, regardless of politics or racial differences. And if the day comes when you have the chance to help American families in similar trouble, I hope you'll remember this moment and choose compassion over revenge." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind through the desert brush and the labored breathing of the sick children. Sam's answer had surprised everyone, including himself. He hadn't planned to make such a statement about future reconciliation, but something about the situation demanded honesty about his deeper hopes for the territory's future. Maria Santos looked down at Miguel, then back at Sam. "You ask us to trust not just you, but your people. This is much to ask from those who have seen promises broken many times." "I know," Sam replied. "But it has to start somewhere. It has to start with someone being willing to risk something real for people they're supposed to consider enemies." Lieutenant Thompson had been watching this exchange with growing amazement. In his 2 years on the frontier, he had seen nothing but escalating cycles of violence and mistrust between Apache and American communities. The possibility that a simple act of humanitarian aid could begin to break those cycles had never occurred to him. But he was witnessing something that challenged every assumption he held about frontier relations. "Mr. Hayes," Thompson said, "assuming these families agree to your assistance, how do you propose to handle the logistics?" "The nearest doctor is in Esperanza, 20 miles south. In this heat, with sick children, that's a dangerous journey." Sam had been thinking about the same problem. "The Circle W has a spring wagon and a good team. We can make the trip in 4 hours if we travel smart and take adequate water. Dr. Harrison in Esperanza has dealt with dehydration cases before. He'll know what to do." "And the cost of medical treatment?" Joseph Blackhorse asked. "We have no American money. I'll cover the medical expenses," Sam said without hesitation. "Dr. Harrison is a decent man. He won't refuse to treat sick children because of their parents' race, and he won't demand payment before providing emergency care." Sergeant O'Connor stepped closer to Lieutenant Thompson. "Sir, if we're going to do this, we should move quickly. Those children don't have much time, and the heat's only going to get worse." Thompson nodded, then addressed the Apache families directly. "I need a decision now. Mr. Hayes is offering to help, but this arrangement requires your consent and cooperation. Do you accept his assistance?" Joseph Blackhorse looked around at his people, particularly the mothers holding sick children. The decision was ultimately theirs to make, but he could see the desperate hope in their faces. They had exhausted every other option, and this unexpected offer from an American cowboy might be their children's only chance for survival. "We accept," Joseph said formally, "but we also make our own promise. If Samuel Hayes saves our children, the debt will be remembered. Apache people do not forget those who show mercy when mercy was not required." The words carried weight that went beyond simple gratitude. In Apache culture, such debts created obligations that could span generations, binding families and communities in relationships of mutual responsibility and respect. Sam didn't fully understand the cultural significance of what Joseph was saying, but he recognized the solemnity of the moment. Maria Santos approached Sam and, to everyone's surprise, placed Miguel gently in the cowboy's arms. The boy was frighteningly light, his small body showing the devastating effects of prolonged dehydration. But he was still breathing, and Sam could feel the faint but steady heartbeat that meant there was still time to save him. "His sister Elena is worse," Maria said quietly. "She has not moved since dawn. Please." Sam looked down at the unconscious child in his arms, feeling the full weight of the responsibility he had accepted. This wasn't just about helping strangers anymore. It was about proving that the deep divisions between communities could be bridged by simple human decency. Miguel's life had become a symbol of everything Sam believed about the possibility of building a better future in the Arizona Territory. "Lieutenant Thompson," Sam said, "I'll need your help getting these children to the wagon safely, and I'd appreciate it if you could send word ahead to Dr. Harrison that we're coming with emergency cases." Thompson nodded, already organizing his men to assist with the evacuation. "Sergeant O'Connor, take 2 men and ride hard to Esperanza. Tell Dr. Harrison to prepare for severe dehydration cases involving children. Mr. Hayes, my remaining soldiers will escort your wagon to ensure safe passage." As the rescue operation began to take shape, Sam realized that what had started as a routine patrol to clear Apache families from a water source had transformed into something unprecedented, a collaborative effort between military, civilian, and Apache communities to save innocent lives. The traditional boundaries that had defined frontier conflict were dissolving in the face of immediate human need. But even as hope began to replace despair, Sam understood that the real test lay ahead. Getting the children to medical care was only the first step. The larger question was whether this act of compassion could survive the political and cultural pressures that would inevitably follow once word of the incident spread. Throughout the territory, William Crawford was expecting his foreman to return with a report of successful Apache removal. The military command at Fort Verde would demand explanations for Lieutenant Thompson's deviation from standard policy. The townspeople of Esperanza would have strong opinions about treating Apache patients, and the Apache communities throughout the region would be watching to see whether American promises of help proved genuine or became another source of betrayal and disappointment. As Sam carefully placed Miguel in the back of the spring wagon, cushioned by blankets that Joseph Blackhorse had provided, he understood that he had crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. His simple decision to help dying children had committed him to a path that would test everything he believed about courage, compassion, and the possibility of building bridges between communities that had been taught to see each other as enemies. The sun was climbing toward its noon peak as the unlikely convoy prepared to depart for Esperanza, a U.S. Army escort protecting an American cowboy who was risking everything to save Apache children. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone present, but the immediate urgency of saving lives overshadowed the broader implications of what they were attempting to accomplish together. The journey to Esperanza began under circumstances that no one present had ever imagined possible. A U.S. Army patrol rode alongside a spring wagon driven by an American cowboy who was carrying Apache children to safety, while Apache parents walked beside the wagon to comfort their sick young ones. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, but for the first time in weeks, the families traveling this harsh landscape carried hope instead of desperation. Sam Hayes had rigged a canvas canopy over the wagon bed to provide shade for Miguel and Elena, the 2 youngest patients. Maria Santos walked beside the wagon, one hand constantly reaching through the slats to check on her children's breathing. Joseph Blackhorse rode his elderly horse parallel to the convoy, his weathered face showing the strain of someone who had been responsible for too many lives for too long, but was finally seeing a path toward salvation. Lieutenant Thompson had dispatched Sergeant O'Connor ahead with 2 soldiers to prepare Dr. Harrison for the incoming emergency cases, but he remained with the convoy to ensure safe passage. The lieutenant found himself in the unprecedented position of protecting Apache families rather than removing them, and the experience was challenging every assumption he had developed about frontier military service. "Mr. Hayes," Thompson called out as they navigated around a particularly rough section of desert terrain. "How well do you know Dr. Harrison? Can we count on his cooperation with treating Apache patients?" Sam had been wondering about the same thing. Dr. Frederick Harrison had served the Esperanza community for 6 years, earning respect for his medical skills and dedication to helping anyone who needed care. But treating Apache patients would test even the most charitable physician's willingness to risk community backlash. "Doc Harrison took an oath to help sick people," Sam replied, adjusting the canvas to better protect Elena from the blazing sun. "He's never asked me about a patient's politics before treating them. But this will be different. This will put him in the middle of territorial conflicts he's tried to avoid." Maria Santos looked up from walking beside the wagon. If this doctor refuses to help, what then? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything they were attempting. Sam had been so focused on getting the children to medical care that he hadn't fully considered what would happen if that care was denied. Esperanza, like most frontier towns, had strong opinions about Apache relations, and not all of those opinions favored humanitarian assistance. "Then we keep going until we find someone who will help," Sam said with more confidence than he felt. "There's a mission doctor in Tucson, and military physicians at Fort Verde. Someone will treat these children." Joseph Blackhorse had been listening to this conversation with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to trust promises too quickly. "In my experience, American doctors serve American patients. Apache children may not qualify for such mercy." Lieutenant Thompson found himself in the unusual position of defending civilian medical ethics to an Apache elder. "Mr. Blackhorse, military physicians are required to treat anyone in medical distress, regardless of their tribal affiliation. If Dr. Harrison proves unwilling, I can arrange treatment through Army Medical Services. And what will your superiors say about using military resources to treat Apache patients?" Joseph asked pointedly. Thompson had been wondering about the same thing. His decision to support Sam's rescue mission was already stretching his authority beyond reasonable limits. Committing military medical resources would require explanations he wasn't sure he could provide convincingly. "That will depend on how this situation develops," Thompson admitted. "But I've made a commitment to see this through, and I intend to honor it." As the convoy continued toward Esperanza, word of their unusual mission was spreading ahead of them through the network of ranchers, soldiers, and townspeople who monitored all movement in the territory. Sergeant O'Connor's advance party had created a stir when they arrived in town with news that Apache patients were incoming, and opinions were sharply divided about how the community should respond. Dr. Harrison had immediately begun preparing his medical supplies and equipment, but he had also sent messages to community leaders, alerting them to the situation. Mayor Charles Whitfield had called an emergency meeting of the town council to discuss the implications of treating Apache patients in their community. Some council members argued that providing medical care was a humanitarian obligation that transcended political boundaries. Others worried that helping Apache families would encourage more unauthorized presence in American-controlled areas. The debate revealed deep divisions within the Esperanza community about their relationship with Apache populations. Reverend Michael O'Brien, who had arrived in the territory with strong convictions about Christian charity, argued passionately for providing medical assistance regardless of the patient's tribal affiliation. "These are children created in God's image," he told the council. "Our duty as Christians is clear." But rancher David Patterson, who had lost cattle to Apache raids the previous year, saw the situation differently. "Start helping them today, and tomorrow we'll have every Apache family in the territory showing up at our door expecting free medical care and supplies." Where does it end? The division wasn't simply about race or politics. It reflected fundamental differences in how community members understood their obligations to outsiders and their responsibility for maintaining security in an unstable region. Some residents had positive experiences with individual Apache traders and workers. Others had suffered losses during conflicts and raids. These personal experiences shaped their willingness to embrace or reject Sam Hayes's humanitarian mission. Dr. Harrison found himself at the center of these community tensions, but his medical training provided clear guidance about his professional obligations. When Mayor Whitfield arrived at the doctor's office to discuss the incoming patients, Harrison was already laying out surgical instruments and preparing medications for severe dehydration cases. "Doc, the council is concerned about the precedent this might set," Whitfield said carefully. "We support humanitarian assistance, but we need to consider the broader implications." Harrison looked up from his preparations with the steady gaze of someone who had spent years making life and death decisions. "Charles, when dying children arrive at my door, I don't have time to consider broader implications. My job is to save lives, not to make territorial policy. But what about community safety? What if this encourages more Apache presence in our area? Then we'll deal with that problem when it arises," Harrison replied firmly. "But I won't let children die while we debate hypothetical future scenarios." Meanwhile, the convoy was making steady progress across the desert despite the challenging conditions. Miguel had regained consciousness briefly, managing to take small sips of water that Maria offered him. Elena remained unconscious, but her breathing had stabilized somewhat in the shade and cooler air of the wagon. The improvement was modest, but it was enough to sustain hope that they would reach medical care in time. Sam had been thinking about the larger implications of what they were attempting. If the rescue mission succeeded, it would demonstrate that cooperation between Apache and American communities was possible even in crisis situations. But success would also require ongoing support from people who had never been asked to extend such trust and assistance to traditional enemies. "Maria," Sam said during one of their brief stops to rest the horses and check on the children, "what will happen with your people when word spreads about American help? Will they see this as a sign of hope or as dangerous dependence on outsiders?" Maria considered the question carefully before answering. "My people have learned to be suspicious of American promises. Too many times, help has come with conditions that ultimately hurt us more than the original problem." She looked toward Miguel, who was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. "But some will remember that when our children were dying, you risked everything to save them. That kind of memory can change how people think about possibilities." Joseph Blackhorse overheard their conversation and added his own perspective. "Change comes slowly to both our peoples, but sometimes a single act of genuine kindness can plant seeds that grow into larger understanding. The question is whether those seeds will be allowed to grow or whether they will be crushed by fear and old hatreds." Lieutenant Thompson had been riding slightly ahead of the wagon, scanning the horizon for potential threats or complications. But he was also listening to the conversations around him and beginning to understand that the rescue mission had implications far beyond saving 2 sick children. If successful, this collaboration could provide a model for future interactions between communities that had been locked in seemingly endless conflict. As Esperanza came into view in the distance, its adobe buildings shimmering in the heat waves rising from the desert floor, Sam felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had successfully transported the children across 20 miles of brutal terrain, and medical help was now within reach. But the real test would come when they arrived in town and discovered whether the Esperanza community would embrace or reject their unprecedented mission of cross-cultural humanitarian assistance. The children's lives hung in the balance, but so did the possibility of proving that Apache and American communities could work together when human need transcended political boundaries. Everything that followed would depend on the courage and compassion of people who had never been asked to extend trust and assistance to those they had been taught to consider enemies. The convoy's arrival in Esperanza created a spectacle that brought nearly every resident out into the streets. Word had spread quickly through the small community about the incoming Apache patients, and opinions were divided enough that the atmosphere felt charged with potential conflict. Some townspeople gathered with curiosity and concern, while others stood with arms crossed and expressions that clearly communicated their disapproval of what they viewed as dangerous. precedent-setting Dr. Harrison emerged from his medical office as the wagon approached, his sleeves already rolled up and his medical bag in hand. Behind him came Reverend O'Brien and Mayor Whitfield, representing the two sides of the community debate that had been raging since Sergeant O'Connor's advance warning. The tension was palpable as Sam Hayes carefully lifted Miguel from the wagon bed, the unconscious child's condition immediately visible to everyone present. "Dear God," whispered Mrs. Catherine Miller, the town school teacher, as she saw Elena being carried by Maria Santos. "Those poor babies." But her compassionate response was immediately countered by rancher David Patterson, who stepped forward with several other men blocking the path to Dr. Harrison's office. "Now hold on just a minute," Patterson declared loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. "We need to talk about what's happening here before anyone goes charging ahead with medical treatment." Dr. Harrison's face flushed red with anger. "David, these children are dying. Whatever political discussion you want to have can wait until after I've treated my patients." "Your patients?" Patterson challenged. "These are Apache Indians, Doc. Since when do we provide free medical care to people who've been raiding our settlements and stealing our cattle?" The confrontation escalated quickly as community members chose sides. Reverend O'Brien stepped forward to support Dr. Harrison. "Mr. Patterson, these are children in medical distress. Our Christian duty is clear, regardless of their tribal affiliation. Christian duty doesn't extend to encouraging more Apache presence in our area," Patterson shot back. "Help them today, and tomorrow we'll have every sick Indian in the territory showing up expecting free care." Sam Hayes found himself holding a dying child while adults argued about policy and politics. The absurdity and cruelty of the situation finally pushed him beyond patience. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice carrying across the town square with authority that surprised everyone present. "While you people stand here debating, these children are dying in my arms. If you want to argue about territorial policy, do it after we save their lives." Lieutenant Thompson stepped forward to support Sam's position. "As ranking military officer present, I'm declaring this a medical emergency that takes precedence over civilian political concerns. Dr. Harrison, you have military authority to proceed with treatment." Patterson wasn't prepared to back down, even in the face of military intervention. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, you've exceeded your authority. Military policy doesn't require us to provide medical care to Apache Indians, and community policy certainly doesn't." The standoff was interrupted by an unexpected voice. Mrs. Elena Vasquez, whose husband worked as a translator for the territorial government, had been watching the confrontation with growing disgust. She stepped out of the crowd and approached Maria Santos directly. "Señora," Mrs. Vasquez said in Spanish, then switched to heavily accented English, "I am mother too. I help you carry your daughter to the doctor." The simple offer of help from one mother to another cut through the political rhetoric like a knife. Mrs. Vasquez reached out to support Elena's weight, sharing the burden with Maria Santos as they moved toward Dr. Harrison's office. The gesture was so natural and human that it made the opposition's arguments seem petty and cruel by comparison. Reverend O'Brien seized the moment. "Mrs. Vasquez has shown us what Christian charity looks like in practice. Who among us will follow her example?" Several townspeople stepped forward, including Tom Bradley, the ranch hand who had criticized Sam's decision to stay with the Apache families. "I still think you're crazy, Sam," Bradley said quietly, "but I can't stand here watching children suffer while we argue about it." The community divide was becoming visible as people literally chose sides by their physical positioning. Those supporting medical treatment gathered around Dr. Harrison and the families carrying sick children. Those opposing it remained clustered around Patterson, but their numbers were dwindling as the human reality of the situation overcame abstract political concerns. Dr. Harrison took advantage of the shifting momentum. "I'm going to examine these children now. Anyone who wants to help is welcome. Anyone who wants to interfere can answer to both military and territorial medical authorities." As the doctor began his examination of Miguel, the crisis took an unexpected turn. The boy, who had been unconscious for most of the journey, suddenly went into convulsions. His small body shook violently while his breathing became rapid and shallow. Dr. Harrison immediately recognized the symptoms of severe electrolyte imbalance brought on by prolonged dehydration. "I need hot water, clean linens, and my surgical instruments immediately," Harrison ordered. "This child is going into shock." The medical emergency transformed the political debate into a life-and-death race against time. Even some of Patterson's supporters found themselves helping to carry supplies and prepare the medical facility. Mrs. Miller took charge of boiling water, while Reverend O'Brien organized volunteers to assist with whatever the doctor needed. Lieutenant Thompson positioned his soldiers around the medical office to prevent any interference with the treatment. But the precaution proved unnecessary. The sight of a child fighting for his life had dissolved most of the community's resistance to providing medical care. Maria Santos watched her son's convulsions with the terrible helplessness of a mother who could do nothing but pray and trust in the skills of a doctor she had never met before. Sam Hayes stood beside her, his large hand resting gently on her shoulder in a gesture of support that transcended all the cultural and political boundaries that were supposed to separate them. "Doctor," Maria whispered, "will he live?" Dr. Harrison was too focused on his patient to offer false reassurance. "I don't know yet," he replied honestly, "but I'm going to do everything in my power to save him." The treatment required resources and assistance that tested the community's commitment to their humanitarian gesture. Dr. Harrison needed expensive medications that represented a significant portion of his medical supplies. The process required multiple assistants working in close coordination. Most challenging of all, it required the community to commit fully to saving the life of an Apache child, knowing that success would establish precedents for future cross-cultural cooperation. As Dr. Harrison worked to stabilize Miguel's condition, Elena was brought into the medical office, showing signs of similar deterioration. The 4-year-old girl had been unconscious longer than her brother, and her condition was even more critical. Treating both children simultaneously would require all of Dr. Harrison's skills and the coordinated assistance of multiple volunteers. Joseph Blackhorse had been standing outside the medical office, watching the American community struggle with their response to Apache medical needs. The elderly leader understood that this moment would determine not just whether 2 children lived or died, but whether future cooperation between their communities was possible. "Mr. Hayes," Joseph said quietly, drawing Sam aside from the medical activity, "what you do here today will be remembered by Apache people for many generations. If these children live because of American mercy, it will change how our young warriors think about your people." Sam was too focused on Miguel's condition to fully process the long-term implications Joseph was describing. "Right now, I just want these children to survive. Everything else can be sorted out later, but everything else depends on what happens now," Joseph replied. "Success here proves that cooperation is possible. Failure proves that old hatreds are stronger than human compassion." The weight of Joseph's words settled on Sam as he realized that Miguel and Elena had become symbols of something much larger than individual medical cases. Their survival or death would influence relationships between Apache and American communities throughout the territory. The precedent being set in Dr. Harrison's office would echo through future generations of both peoples. As the medical crisis intensified, the community's response revealed both the best and worst aspects of frontier character. Some residents demonstrated remarkable generosity and courage in helping with the treatment. Others remained convinced that providing assistance would ultimately endanger their own families and community. The division reflected fundamental differences in how people understood their obligations to outsiders and their responsibilities for maintaining security in an unstable region. The next few hours would determine not only whether 2 Apache children lived or died, but whether an entire territory could move beyond the cycles of violence and mistrust that had defined frontier relations for generations. Dr. Harrison emerged from his medical office 3 hours after beginning treatment, his shirt soaked with sweat and his hands trembling from exhaustion. The entire town of Esperanza had gathered in the street, waiting for news about the Apache children whose lives had become the focal point of their community's moral transformation. The silence was absolute as everyone searched the doctor's face for signs of success or tragedy. "Miguel will live," Harrison announced, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "His fever has broken, and he's taking fluids normally. Elena—" He paused, and the collective breath-holding was audible. "Elena will need continued care, but she's stable. Both children should make full recoveries with proper rest and nutrition." The cheer that erupted from the crowd surprised everyone, including those who had initially opposed treating the Apache patients. Mrs. Miller burst into tears of relief, while Reverend O'Brien fell to his knees in thanksgiving. Even David Patterson, who had led the opposition to providing medical care, found himself nodding with satisfaction at the successful outcome. Maria Santos emerged from the medical office holding Miguel, who was weak but conscious and able to speak in whispered Apache to his mother. The sight of the reunited family created a moment of such pure, human joy that it transcended all the political and cultural boundaries that had seemed so important just hours earlier. Sam Hayes stood beside the medical office, watching the community's reaction with amazement. The same people who had been arguing about territorial policy and Apache relations were now celebrating the survival of children they had never met before. The transformation was so complete and unexpected that he struggled to understand how it had happened so quickly. Lieutenant Thompson approached Sam with a thoughtful expression. "Mr. Hayes, I've served on the frontier for 2 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened here today. This community came together to save Apache children despite their initial resistance. How do we build on this success?" The question revealed the challenge that would determine whether the day's events became an isolated incident or the beginning of larger changes in frontier relations. Saving Miguel and Elena had proven that cooperation was possible, but sustaining that cooperation would require ongoing commitment from both Apache and American communities. Joseph Blackhorse had been observing the celebration with the careful attention of someone who understood the difference between momentary emotion and lasting change. He approached Sam and Lieutenant Thompson with a proposal that would test whether the day's humanitarian success could evolve into something more substantial. "Mr. Hayes." "Lieutenant Thompson," Joseph said formally, "my people wish to offer something in return for the mercy shown to our children today." Sam was curious but cautious. "What kind of offer, Mr. Blackhorse?" Joseph gestured toward the desert beyond Esperanza. "The drought affects all people in this territory. Apache knowledge of water sources and desert survival could help American communities endure the difficult times ahead. We propose sharing this knowledge as payment for medical care and as gesture of goodwill." The offer was unprecedented. Apache survival techniques had been closely guarded secrets for generations, representing accumulated wisdom about living in harmony with one of the world's harshest environments. Sharing such knowledge with American settlers would demonstrate trust that went far beyond simple gratitude for medical assistance. Dr. Harrison, still exhausted from the medical procedures but energized by their success, immediately recognized the value of Joseph's proposal. "Mr. Blackhorse, that knowledge could save many lives during drought conditions. Our community would be honored to learn from Apache expertise." Mayor Whitfield had been listening to this conversation with growing excitement about the possibilities it represented. "Gentlemen, what you're describing could transform how our communities relate to each other. Instead of competition and conflict, we could have cooperation and mutual assistance." But David Patterson remained skeptical of the larger implications. "All this sounds fine in theory, but what happens when the drought ends and conditions return to normal? Will these friendly relations survive when we're competing for the same resources again? The question cut to the heart of the challenge facing both communities. The crisis had created conditions that made cooperation necessary for survival, but those same conditions were temporary. Building lasting relationships would require finding common ground that extended beyond immediate shared need. Maria Santos, still holding Miguel but now strong enough to participate in the discussion, offered her own perspective on the sustainability question. In Apache tradition, debts of life are never forgotten. My children live because of American mercy. This creates obligations that extend to their children and their children's children. Sam was beginning to understand that the day's events had created something much larger than a single act of humanitarian assistance. The rescue of Miguel and Elena had established precedents and relationships that could influence frontier development for generations to come. What if we formalize these arrangements? Sam suggested. What if Esperanza and the local Apache communities established official agreements for sharing knowledge, resources, and assistance during emergencies? Lieutenant Thompson nodded thoughtfully. The military could support such agreements if they contributed to regional stability. Reducing conflicts between communities would serve legitimate security interests. Reverend O'Brien, who had been quiet during the policy discussions, spoke up with his own vision for building on the day's success. What we've witnessed today is proof that our communities share fundamental values about protecting innocent life. Perhaps we could establish regular exchanges that help both our peoples understand those shared values. The conversation continued for hours as representatives from both communities worked to transform momentary cooperation into sustainable partnership. The ideas that emerged were ambitious and unprecedented. Joint water management projects that combined Apache knowledge with American engineering, shared medical facilities that served both communities, educational exchanges that taught Apache children English and reading while teaching American children desert survival skills. Dr. Harrison proposed establishing a permanent medical clinic that would serve both communities, staffed by doctors trained in both Western medicine and traditional Apache healing practices. The combination of medical approaches could be more effective than either tradition alone, he argued. Joseph Blackhorse suggested creating formal drought response protocols that would allow communities to share resources and knowledge during future emergencies. The desert teaches harsh lessons about survival. Those who learn to help each other during difficult times are more likely to thrive when conditions improve. As the discussions progressed, it became clear that the rescue of two Apache children had catalyzed conversations about fundamental changes in how frontier communities could develop. Instead of the traditional pattern of competition, conflict, and displacement, both groups were envisioning cooperation, mutual assistance, and shared prosperity. But implementing these ambitious ideas would require overcoming centuries of mistrust and establishing new institutions that served both communities' interests. The challenge was enormous, but the success of the day's humanitarian mission had proven that dramatic change was possible when people chose compassion over conflict. Sam Hayes found himself at the center of these discussions, not because he had sought such a role, but because his willingness to risk everything for dying children had earned him the trust of both communities. His ranch experience had taught him practical skills for managing complex projects, and his demonstrated commitment to Apache welfare had overcome traditional suspicions about American motives. "If we're going to make this work," Sam said as the evening discussions continued, "we need to start with small projects that build trust and demonstrate success. Grand gestures are impressive, but lasting change comes from proving that cooperation produces better results than conflict." The wisdom of this approach was immediately apparent to everyone present. Rather than attempting to revolutionize frontier relations overnight, they would begin with specific, manageable projects that could serve as models for larger changes. The first project would be establishing a shared water monitoring system that helped both communities track drought conditions and plan resource allocation. Apache knowledge of seasonal patterns and natural indicators would be combined with American record-keeping and communication systems to create early warning networks. For future water crises, the second project would be expanding Dr. Harrison's medical practice to include regular clinics that served Apache families. Maria Santos would serve as a cultural liaison, helping to bridge communication gaps and ensure that medical care was provided in ways that respected Apache traditions and beliefs. The third project would be establishing emergency response protocols that allowed both communities to share resources during crises. The day's successful rescue mission had proven that cooperation was possible, but formalizing such arrangements would ensure that future emergencies received coordinated responses rather than competitive ones. As the sun set over Esperanza, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and red, Sam Hayes reflected on how completely his life had changed in a single day. He had begun the morning as a ranch foreman concerned primarily with cattle and water rights. He was ending it as the unofficial coordinator of the most ambitious cross-cultural cooperation project in Arizona Territory history, the Children, whose near-death experience had triggered these remarkable changes, were sleeping peacefully in Dr. Harrison's clinic, their recovery serving as living proof that compassion could triumph over conflict when people chose to act on their highest values rather than their deepest fears. 5 years after Samuel Hayes first carried dying Apache children to safety in Esperanza, the Arizona Territory had become a model for cross-cultural cooperation that attracted visitors from across the American West and beyond. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been without setbacks and challenges. But the foundation laid during that drought-stricken summer of 1883 had grown into something unprecedented in frontier history. The Esperanza Apache Medical Cooperative had become the most successful shared healthcare system in the territory. Dr. Harrison's clinic now employed 3 physicians, including Dr. James Blackhorse, Joseph's nephew, who had studied medicine at Harvard University before returning to serve both communities. The combination of Western medical techniques with traditional Apache healing practices had produced remarkable results, particularly in treating desert-related injuries and illnesses. Maria Santos had become far more than a cultural liaison. Her natural intelligence and fierce dedication to protecting vulnerable people had led her to study nursing under Dr. Harrison's guidance. At 37, she was now the head administrator of the medical cooperative, overseeing programs that served over 2,000 people across 15 different communities throughout central Arizona. Miguel and Elena, the children whose near-death experience had triggered the entire transformation, were now thriving 11- and 9-year-olds who served as living symbols of what cooperation could accomplish. Miguel had shown remarkable aptitude for mechanical engineering and was working with Sam Hayes on irrigation projects that combined Apache knowledge of seasonal water patterns with innovative American technology. Elena had inherited her mother's gift for languages and served as a translator for the growing number of trade agreements between Apache and American businesses. Sam Hayes had never returned to his position as foreman of the Circle W Ranch. Instead, he had established the Hayes Cooperative Development Company, which helped communities throughout the Southwest implement collaborative resource management programs. His success in bridging cultural divides had made him one of the most sought-after consultants in the territory, but he remained based in Esperanza, committed to the community that had first proven cooperation was possible. The water management system that had emerged from the initial crisis response had evolved into a sophisticated network that served communities across 300 square miles of desert. Apache knowledge of underground water sources and seasonal rainfall Patterns had been combined with American engineering expertise to create irrigation systems that had turned previously barren land into productive agricultural areas. The most remarkable transformation had occurred in the economic relationships between communities. What had begun as emergency resource sharing had evolved into formal trade partnerships that benefited everyone involved. Apache craftspeople were producing goods for sale in American markets, while American farmers were supplying food products to Apache communities. The mutual economic dependence had created incentives for peaceful cooperation that went far beyond humanitarian sentiment. Lieutenant Thompson, now Captain Thompson, had built his military career on the success of the Esperanza model. His innovative approach to frontier peacekeeping through community cooperation had attracted attention from military leadership in Washington, and he had been assigned to implement similar programs throughout the Southwestern Territories. The Thompson Doctrine, which emphasized building relationships between communities rather than simply enforcing separation, was being studied by military academies and implemented by frontier commanders from Texas to California. But the impact extended far beyond the immediate region. Word of the Arizona cooperation experiments had reached newspaper editors, government officials, and social reformers throughout the United States. Delegations arrived regularly from other territories and states to study the Esperanza model and adapt its lessons to their own regional conflicts. Professor William Richardson from Columbia University had spent 6 months documenting the transformation for a comprehensive study of frontier social development. His findings challenged many assumptions about inevitable conflict between different cultural groups. What we observe in Arizona, Richardson wrote, is proof that cooperation and mutual assistance can produce greater prosperity and security for all parties than competition and conflict ever could. The success had not been without its critics and challenges. Some traditional Apache leaders argued that cooperation with Americans threatened tribal independence and cultural integrity. Some American settlers and business interests complained that sharing resources with Apache communities reduced opportunities for individual advancement and profit. David Patterson, who had initially led opposition to treating Apache patients, had eventually become one of the program's most effective advocates. His ranch now employed Apache workers year-round and had become one of the most profitable operations in the territory through the use of traditional knowledge about desert agriculture combined with modern ranching techniques. "I was wrong," Patterson admitted during a territorial legislative hearing on expanding the cooperation programs. "I thought helping them would hurt us. Instead, I learned that we all do better when we all do better. My ranch is more successful now than it ever was before we started working together." The legislative hearings were part of efforts to formally codify the informal agreements that had developed between communities. Territorial Governor Frederick Treitel had proposed legislation that would provide legal framework and financial support for cooperative development projects throughout Arizona. The proposed Arizona Cooperation Act would establish funding mechanisms, dispute resolution procedures, and standards for shared resource management that could serve as models for other territories. The political implications of the Arizona experiments were being debated in Washington as well. Congressman Samuel Morrison of Ohio had introduced federal legislation that would encourage similar cooperation programs in other territories with significant Native American populations. The Morrison Act would provide federal funding for cooperative development projects and establish national standards for cross-cultural collaboration. What has been accomplished in Arizona proves that the traditional approach to Indian relations has been both morally wrong and practically counterproductive. Morrison argued in congressional testimony, instead of policies based on separation, conflict, and forced assimilation, we should be implementing programs based on cooperation, mutual respect, and shared prosperity. The religious implications had been equally significant. Reverend O'Brien had founded the Interfaith Cooperation Movement, which brought together Christian missionaries, Apache spiritual leaders, and practitioners of other faiths to find common ground in serving community needs. The movement had established schools, hospitals, and social service programs throughout the Southwest based on shared values rather than competing religious doctrines. The educational innovations had been particularly remarkable. The Esperanza Cooperative School served children from both communities, teaching traditional academic subjects alongside practical skills for desert survival, cross-cultural communication, and collaborative problem-solving. Students learned to speak both English and Apache languages, studied both American and Apache history, and developed skills that prepared them for leadership roles in the emerging cooperative economy. Azena Santos had become one of the school's most promising students, demonstrating exceptional abilities in mathematics, languages, and organizational leadership. At 9 years old, she was already helping to coordinate exchange programs that brought Apache children to study in American schools while American children learned traditional skills from Apache elders. Miguel Santos had focused his studies on engineering and technology, working with Sam Hayes on projects that combined traditional knowledge with modern innovations. His designs for improved irrigation systems were being implemented throughout the territory, and several universities had expressed interest in providing scholarships for his continued education. The success of the cooperation programs had attracted international attention as well. Delegations from Canada, Mexico, and several European countries had visited Arizona to study the implications for their own indigenous relations policies. The British government was considering implementing similar programs in areas with significant Aboriginal populations, while Mexican officials were exploring cooperation agreements with indigenous communities along their northern borders. Dr. Frederick Harrison had documented the medical innovations that emerged from combining Western and Apache healing traditions. His research had been published in medical journals throughout the United States and Europe, contributing to growing interest in cross-cultural approaches to healthcare. The Esperanza model was being studied by medical schools and implemented by physicians working with indigenous populations throughout North America. Joseph Blackhorse, now in his 70s, had become a respected elder whose wisdom influenced both Apache and American communities. His nephew's success as a physician had validated his long-held belief that Apache young people could succeed in American educational systems while maintaining their cultural identity and values. The children who nearly died that summer taught us something important. Joseph reflected during a ceremony celebrating the 5th anniversary of the cooperation agreements. They taught us that when people choose to save each other's children, they create bonds that can overcome any obstacle. Maria Santos had emerged as one of the most influential leaders in the territory, but her success had come at personal cost. The demands of her work with the medical cooperative and her role as a cultural bridge between communities left little time for personal relationships. She remained devoted to her children and to the larger mission of proving that cooperation could create a better future for everyone. The economic data told a compelling story about the success of the cooperation model. Communities participating in the resource-sharing programs had higher agricultural productivity, lower infant mortality rates, reduced crime, and greater population stability than comparable communities operating under traditional competitive models. The cooperative economy had created wealth that benefited all participants rather than concentrating resources among a few successful individuals. As the 5th anniversary celebration continued into the evening, Sam Hayes stood with Maria Santos, watching Miguel and Elena play with children from both communities. The sight of Apache and American children playing together, learning from each other, and building friendships that transcended cultural boundaries represented everything they had hoped to accomplish when he first carried dying children across the desert 5 years earlier? Do you think they understand what they started? Maria asked, gesturing toward her children. Sam smiled, remembering the desperate mother who had entrusted her dying son to a stranger's care. I think they understand something more important. They understand that people who care for each other can overcome anything. The legacy of that summer day in 1883 continued to grow, proving that individual acts of courage and compassion could indeed change the world when they inspired others to choose cooperation over conflict, hope over fear, and shared prosperity over zero-sum competition. 10 years had passed since that scorching summer day when Samuel Hayes first carried dying Apache children to safety, and the success of the Arizona cooperation model had attracted both admirers and enemies from across the United States. What had begun as a simple act of humanitarian rescue had evolved into a comprehensive alternative to traditional frontier development. But that success was about to face its greatest challenge. The threat came from an unexpected source, the Consolidated Mining Corporation of Denver, a powerful conglomerate that had been quietly acquiring mineral rights throughout the Southwest. Led by industrialist Nathaniel Whitmore, the corporation had identified significant silver and copper deposits beneath the cooperative farming areas that Apache and American communities had developed together. Whitmore's plan was simple: use legal and political pressure to dissolve the corporation agreements and reclaim the land for large-scale mining operations. The challenge was more sophisticated than previous opposition to the Arizona model. Instead of appealing to racial prejudice or frontier suspicions, Whitmore's campaign focused on legal technicalities and economic arguments. He hired lawyers who argued that the informal cooperation agreements violated federal treaty obligations and territorial mining laws. He funded newspaper articles that questioned whether cooperative development was economically competitive with traditional industrial approaches. Most dangerously, Whitmore had gained the support of Territorial Governor James Morrison, who had replaced the cooperation-friendly Frederick Tritle the previous year. Morrison represented Eastern business interests who viewed the Arizona experiments as obstacles to profitable resource extraction. His administration began implementing policies designed to undermine the legal foundations of the cooperative agreements. Sam Hayes, now 44 years old and weathered by a decade of community development work, received the first warning about the new threat during a meeting with Captain Thompson at Fort Verde. The military officer had learned about Whitmore's campaign through intelligence reports from Washington, and the implications were alarming. "Sam, they're not just targeting individual communities," Thompson explained, spreading maps across his office desk. "They want to break up the entire cooperative network and reclaim over 50,000 acres for industrial development. They've got lawyers arguing that Apache participation in these agreements violates the terms of federal reservations. The legal strategy was cleverly designed to exploit weaknesses in the informal systems that had developed over the past decade. The cooperation agreements had been based on mutual trust and shared interests rather than formal legal frameworks. This flexibility had allowed rapid adaptation to changing circumstances, but it also left the communities vulnerable to legal challenges they were unprepared to fight. Maria Santos, now 39 and recognized throughout the territory as one of its most effective leaders, had been anticipating such a challenge for years. Her work as administrator of the medical cooperative had taught her about the political realities that threatened community-based development, and she had been quietly building alliances with sympathetic lawyers and government officials. "This was always going to happen," Maria told Sam during an emergency meeting of community leaders. "Success makes enemies. The question is whether we've built something strong enough to survive a coordinated attack from people with more money and political power than we have." The immediate challenge was legal, but the larger issue was whether the cooperative communities could maintain their unity and effectiveness when faced with external pressure specifically designed to divide them. Whitmore's strategy included offering individual communities economic incentives to withdraw from the cooperative agreements, creating financial pressures that would be difficult to resist. Miguel Santos, now 16 and preparing for university studies in engineering, had been working with Sam Hayes on infrastructure projects throughout the cooperative network. His technical knowledge and cultural connections made him uniquely valuable for coordinating defensive strategies. But the current crisis was testing his maturity and leadership abilities in unprecedented ways. "Mr. Hayes," Miguel said during a planning session, "what if we fight this challenge by proving that our model produces better results than their industrial approach? What if we document everything we've accomplished and use that evidence to defend our legal right to continue?" The suggestion reflected the strategic thinking that had made Miguel an effective leader despite his youth. Instead of simply reacting to Whitmore's attacks, he was proposing that the communities take initiative by demonstrating the superiority of their cooperative approach. Dr. Harrison, now in his 50s and recognized as one of the territory's most respected physicians, offered his support for Miguel's strategy. "I've got 10 years of medical data proving that cooperative communities have better health outcomes than traditional settlements. Lower infant mortality, reduced disease rates, fewer injuries from industrial accidents. That's objective evidence that our approach serves human welfare better than their alternatives." Elena Santos, now 14 and already showing remarkable abilities in languages and diplomacy, had been serving as an unofficial liaison between Apache and American community leaders. Her perspective on the current crisis reflected wisdom beyond her years and deep understanding of the cultural dynamics that made cooperation possible. "The real threat isn't their lawyers or their money," Elena observed during a meeting of the community council. "The real threat is that they're trying to make us afraid of each other again. They want Apache people to think that Americans will abandon them when times get difficult. They want American people to think that Apache people will take advantage of any weakness." Her insight identified the psychological dimension of Whitmore's campaign that was potentially more dangerous than the legal challenges. The cooperation model was based on trust that had been built through years of successful collaboration. But that trust could be undermined by fears about future betrayal or exploitation. Joseph Blackhorse, now in his late 70s, but still mentally sharp and politically astute, understood the historical significance of the current challenge. He had lived through decades of broken promises and failed negotiations with American authorities, and his perspective on the corporation's threat was shaped by that bitter experience. "This is not the first time powerful men have tried to take Apache land for their own profit," Joseph said during a gathering of tribal elders. "But this time is different. This time we have American friends who will stand with us. The question is whether that friendship is strong enough to survive when it becomes expensive." The test Joseph described came sooner than anyone expected. Governor Morrison announced new territorial regulations that would require all cooperative agreements to be renegotiated under stricter legal standards that effectively made them impossible to maintain. The regulations were technically applied to all communities equally, but their practical effect was to target the Apache American cooperation programs specifically. Sam Hayes found himself facing the most difficult decision of his life. The Hayes Cooperative Development Company had become successful enough that he could relocate to California or Texas and continue his work in areas not subject to the new territorial regulations. Several communities outside Arizona had offered substantial contracts for his consulting services. He could abandon the Arizona cooperative and build a comfortable life elsewhere, but walking away would mean abandoning Maria Santos, Miguel, Elena, and hundreds of other people who had trusted him with their family's welfare. It would mean proving that Whitmore's cynical assessment of American character was correct, that when cooperation became expensive or risky, Americans would choose individual advantage over community loyalty. "I'm not leaving," Sam announced during a public meeting that drew over 300 people from throughout the cooperative network. "I made a promise 10 years ago to help build something better than endless conflict between our communities. That promise doesn't become void just because keeping it got more difficult." The commitment Sam made that evening transformed the nature of the struggle against Whitmore's corporation. Instead of communities fighting defensively to preserve existing agreements, they were now fighting proactively to prove that their model could survive any challenge that traditional industrial development could present. Maria Santos organized a comprehensive documentation project that would provide evidence for legal challenges to the new territorial regulations. Teams of volunteers began collecting data on agricultural productivity, economic development, health outcomes, educational achievement, and social stability in cooperative communities versus traditional settlements. Miguel Santos coordinated technical innovations that would demonstrate the superiority of cooperative approaches to resource development. Working with Apache elders and American engineers, he developed mining techniques that extracted minerals without destroying agricultural land, irrigation systems that supported both farming and industrial operations, and transportation networks that served multiple communities efficiently. Elena Santos led cultural exchange programs that brought visitors from throughout the United States to observe the cooperative communities firsthand. Her linguistic abilities and diplomatic skills made her extraordinarily effective at communicating the human dimension of what the communities had accomplished together. Dr. Harrison expanded the medical cooperatives research programs to provide scientific evidence about the health benefits of cooperative community structures. His studies of stress-related illness, childhood development, and aging in cooperative versus competitive environments produced data that attracted attention from medical schools and public health authorities throughout the country. The battle between Whitmore's corporation and the Arizona cooperative communities was attracting national attention. Newspaper editors in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco began publishing articles about the conflict, framing it as a test of whether American democracy could support alternatives to purely competitive capitalism. The stakes had expanded far beyond the original question of whether Apache and American communities could work together successfully. The current struggle was about whether cooperative approaches to economic development could survive in a political system dominated by corporate interests and individual accumulation of wealth. As winter approached in 1893, both sides were preparing for legal and political battles that would determine not only the fate of the Arizona cooperative communities, but the future of cross-cultural collaboration throughout the American West. The outcome would prove whether the simple act of carrying dying children to safety could evolve into a sustainable alternative to the cycles of exploitation and conflict that had characterized so much of American frontier development. The final confrontation came not in a courtroom or legislative chamber, but on the exact spot where Sam Hayes had first discovered dying Apache children 10 years earlier. Nathaniel Whitmore had arranged to meet with community leaders at the old spring site, confident that his legal victories and political pressure had finally broken the resistance to his mining operations. Governor Morrison had issued final orders for the dissolution of all cooperative agreements, and federal marshals were preparing to enforce the new territorial regulations. But when Whitmore arrived at the spring on that crisp December morning in 1893, he found something he hadn't expected. Over 500 people had gathered in the desert: Apache families, American settlers, territorial officials, newspaper reporters, and even a delegation of congressmen who had traveled from Washington to witness the resolution of what had become a nationally watched conflict. Maria Santos stood at the center of the gathering, now 39 years old and recognized throughout the Southwest as one of the most effective leaders of her generation. Beside her were Miguel and Elena, now 16 and 14, representing a generation that had grown up believing that cooperation between different peoples was not only possible, but natural. Sam Hayes stood with them, his weathered face showing the effects of 10 years spent building something unprecedented in American frontier history. "Mr. Whitmore," Maria said, as the industrialist approached with his entourage of lawyers and territorial officials, "you have come to claim land that you believe belongs to your corporation. But before you do, there is something you need to understand about what happened in this place." Whitmore was impatient to complete the legal formalities that would transfer the land to his control. His corporation had invested significant resources in acquiring mineral rights and political support, and delays would only increase costs and complicate implementation of his mining plans. "Mrs. Santos, I appreciate your attachment to this area, but legal ownership has been established through proper channels. This land will be developed for the benefit of all Americans through productive mining operations that will create jobs and generate wealth for the territory." Miguel Santos stepped forward, carrying a leather portfolio that contained 10 years of documentation about the cooperative community's achievements. At 16, he possessed technical knowledge that impressed university professors and practical experience that had earned respect from both Apache elders and American engineers. "Mr. Whitmore, before you take this land, you should know what it has produced under cooperative management," Miguel said, opening the portfolio to reveal charts, graphs, and photographs that told the story of unprecedented success. This area now supports over 2,000 people in 15 different communities. Agricultural productivity is 3 times higher than comparable areas under individual ownership. Medical outcomes are better than anywhere else in the territory. Educational achievement exceeds national averages. Crime rates are virtually zero. Elena Santos added her own perspective, speaking with the diplomatic skills that had made her invaluable in building relationships between different communities. "Mr. Whitmore, your mining operations will extract valuable minerals from this land. But what we have built here is more valuable than silver or copper. We have proven that different peoples can work together to create prosperity that benefits everyone." Dr. Harrison approached with medical records that documented the transformation he had witnessed over the past decade. "Mr. Whitmore, I've practiced medicine in traditional frontier communities and in cooperative communities. The difference in human welfare is dramatic and measurable. What has been accomplished here represents a breakthrough in public health that could benefit millions of people if it's allowed to continue and expand." But Whitmore remained focused on the legal and financial aspects of the situation. "Gentlemen, ladies, I understand your emotional attachment to these experimental programs, but economic development requires efficient resource utilization and professional management. Cooperative arrangements may produce some benefits, but they cannot compete with properly capitalized industrial operations." It was then that Joseph Blackhorse, now 78 years old, but still commanding respect as a tribal elder, stepped forward to address Whitmore directly. The old Apache leader had remained largely silent during the political battles of recent months, but his words carried the weight of decades of experience in dealing with American promises and threats. "Mr. Whitmore," Joseph said in the formal English he had perfected through years of negotiations, "you speak of legal ownership and economic efficiency. But there is something more important than either of those things. There is the debt that must be paid before any other business can be conducted." Whitmore was puzzled by the elder's reference to unpaid debts. His lawyers had researched all financial obligations related to the land acquisition, and no outstanding debts had been identified. "Mr. Blackhorse, if there are legitimate financial claims related to this property, they can be addressed through proper legal channels." Joseph shook his head slowly. "This is not a debt that can be paid with money or resolved by lawyers. This is a debt of life that was created 10 years ago when Apache children were dying, and an American man chose to save them rather than let them die. The elder gestured toward Sam Hayes, whose face showed his surprise at being made the focus of Joseph's statement. Samuel Hayes risked everything to carry dying children to safety. He lost his job, his reputation among his own people, and his security for the sake of Apache children he had never met before. In Apache tradition, such a debt creates obligations that extend through generations. Maria Santos moved to stand beside Joseph, understanding that the moment had come for something she had been planning for years, but had never discussed with anyone, including Sam. Mr. Whitmore, you have legal documents that give you the right to take this land. But I have something more powerful than legal documents. She reached into a beaded bag and withdrew a folded piece of paper that looked old and worn from years of careful preservation. This is the deed to 60,000 acres of land in the Sonoran Desert, including the area where we now stand. It was given to my family by the Mexican government in 1821, before this territory became part of the United States. The revelation stunned everyone present, including Sam Hayes. Maria had never mentioned owning any land, and the implications of her announcement were staggering. If she possessed a valid deed that predated American territorial jurisdiction, it could override all of Whitmore's carefully arranged legal claims. Whitmore's lawyers immediately began examining the document, but their initial assessment was troubling. The deed appeared to be authentic, properly executed according to Mexican law, and potentially valid under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which had guaranteed Mexican land grants when the territory was transferred to the United States. Mrs. Santos, Whitmore said carefully, if this document is genuine, why hasn't it been presented before now? Maria's answer revealed the depth of her strategic thinking and her understanding of both legal and cultural obligations. Because presenting it would have meant claiming ownership of land that my people have always shared with others. Apache tradition teaches that land belongs to all who need it for survival. But American law teaches that ownership is the only way to protect land from those who would exploit it for private profit. She looked directly at Sam Hayes, her expression showing both gratitude and a kind of loving challenge. Samuel Hayes taught me that there are Americans who understand Apache values about sharing and cooperation. He proved that it was possible to build communities where ownership serves everyone rather than just the few who have money and power. Sam was beginning to understand what Maria was preparing to do, and the magnitude of her gesture was overwhelming. Maria, you can't give away land that your family has owned for generations. That inheritance represents security for Miguel and Elena's future. No, Maria replied firmly. Their security comes from living in communities that value cooperation over competition, sharing over hoarding, and human welfare over private profit. The land is just earth and rocks. What matters is what people choose to build together. Elena Santos stepped forward to support her mother's position. Mr. Hayes, this land has been in our family for over 70 years, but it only became truly valuable when you taught us that it could be shared with others in ways that benefited everyone. Miguel added his own perspective, with the practical wisdom that had made him an effective community leader despite his youth. The deed gives us legal ownership, but legal ownership is meaningless without the cooperation of all the people who make the land productive. Mr. Whitmore can take the land by force, but he cannot take the knowledge, skills, and relationships that make it valuable. Governor Morrison had been listening to this exchange with growing frustration. His political career depended on maintaining support from corporate interests like Whitmore's corporation, and the unexpected legal complication threatened to undermine carefully laid plans for territorial development. Mrs. Santos, Morrison said, the territorial government has authority to determine the validity of all land claims within its jurisdiction. This document will need to be reviewed by appropriate officials before any legal significance can be established. But Captain Thompson, representing federal military authority, had a different perspective on the legal situation. Governor Morrison, Mexican land grants that predate American territorial jurisdiction fall under federal treaty obligations. This document appears to establish legitimate ownership that supersedes later territorial regulations. The legal complexity was creating exactly the kind of delay and uncertainty that Whitmore had hoped to avoid. More importantly, the revelation about Maria's ownership had transformed the political dynamics of the entire conflict. Instead of a straightforward case of corporate development versus community resistance, the situation had become a question about whether legal ownership carried obligations to serve broader community welfare. Maria Santos made the announcement that changed everything. "I am transferring ownership of this land to the Hayes Cooperative Development Trust, which will ensure that it continues to serve all the communities that have been built here. The trust will be managed by representatives from both Apache and American communities, with Samuel Hayes as the permanent administrator." The generosity and strategic brilliance of Maria's decision left everyone speechless. By transferring the land to a cooperative trust, rather than fighting to maintain individual ownership, she had solved the legal challenge while reinforcing the principles that had made the community successful. She had also ensured that Sam Hayes, who had risked everything to save her children, would be permanently protected from the kind of corporate pressure that had threatened to destroy his life's work. Sam Hayes found himself struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what Maria had done. "Maria, this is your family's inheritance. You can't give it away because of something I did 10 years ago." Maria Santos smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally found the perfect way to repay a debt that could never be adequately repaid. "Samuel Hayes, 10 years ago you carried my dying children to safety when you could have walked away and saved yourself trouble. You gave them life when they had no hope. What I give you today is just land. What you gave my children was everything." The crowd that had gathered to witness Whitmore's triumph instead found themselves witnessing something unprecedented in American frontier history. Her Apache mother, whose children had been saved by an American cowboy, was giving that cowboy permanent control over land that could make him one of the wealthiest men in the territory. But she was doing it in a way that ensured the land would continue to serve the cooperative communities that had proven cooperation was more powerful than competition. Whitmore realized that his carefully planned corporate takeover had been completely outmaneuvered by a woman whose understanding of both legal strategy and human psychology had exceeded anything his expensive lawyers and political allies had anticipated. The Consolidated Mining Corporation could challenge the land transfer in court, but doing so would mean fighting against both Mexican treaty rights and a heartwarming story of cross-cultural gratitude that was already attracting national media attention as the winter sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the gathered crowd in shades of gold and red. Sam Hayes stood beside Maria Santos and her children, understanding that his life had been transformed once again by people whose capacity for generosity exceeded anything he had ever imagined possible. The reward Maria had given him was more than land or wealth. It was the knowledge that his willingness to carry dying children to safety had created bonds of trust and gratitude that would protect cooperative communities for generations to come. The simple act of compassion that had begun beside a dried-up spring 10 years earlier had evolved into something that proved the highest potential of human cooperation and mutual care. Apache wisdom about sharing and reciprocity had combined with American ideals about building better communities to create a model that would influence frontier development throughout the West. Miguel and Elena Santos, the children whose near-death experience had started the entire transformation, were now young adults whose lives embodied the possibilities that emerged when people chose to care for each other across cultural boundaries. Their survival had become the foundation for communities that proved cooperation could create more prosperity and security than competition ever could. As the crowd began to disperse and Whitmore's defeated entourage prepared to return to Denver, Sam Hayes realized that Maria Santos had given him the most precious gift possible, the chance to spend the rest of his life protecting and expanding something that proved the very best aspects of human nature could triumph over the worst. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.